Welcome to UNSW's Engineering the Future podcast. Today, we're discussing what we should and shouldn't be concerned about regarding PFAS, and how engineers plan to deal with the issues caused by these complex groups of synthetic chemicals over the next 30 years.
PFAS is regulated in Australia in drinking water at very, very low concentrations. And very, very few people in Australia would consume water that's above those guidelines.
That's Professor Denis O'Carroll, a civil and environmental engineering expert from UNSW. On Engineering the Future, we speak to academics and industry leaders who are embracing cutting-edge ideas and pushing the boundaries of what is truly possible. Join us as we discover how world-changing action starts with fearless thinking in Engineering the Future of PFAS Forever Chemicals. Hello, and welcome to Engineering the Future of PFAS Forever Chemicals. My name is Neil Martin, and I'm a journalist and STEM communicator working in the Faculty of Engineering at UNSW. Joining me today to discuss the potential impacts and dangers of PFAS Forever Chemicals over the next 30 years and how we might mitigate or even solve them is Professor Denis O'Carroll. Denis is Deputy Head of School Research in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UNSW, and is actively working to develop destructive PFAS treatment technologies. He is also investigating the factors that control the fate of PFAS in the environment and is an associate editor of the Water Resources Research Journal. Welcome, Denis.
Thank you very much.
Also with us is Andrew Mitchell, an environmental engineer with 25 years of experience in regulation, policy, emergency management, pollution incidents, and site contamination. Andrew currently leads the National Environmental Team at ADE Consulting Group, while previous roles have included being a regulator of contaminated land, funding the cleanup of derelict sites, developing policy and preventative approaches for contamination, managing high-profile remediation projects, and guiding the Department of Defence in investigating and managing PFAS contamination. Through this work, he has developed significant expertise in negotiation, influencing, community consultation, and risk communication. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, glad to be here.
So we're here to talk about PFAS, or to give them their full technical name, pair and polyfluoroalkyl substances. I think that's about as hard to say as it is for them to be broken down, which of course is the big problem, and that's why they're known as forever chemicals. Growing media attention about PFAS has started to spark public debate about how dangerous they might be and what we need to do in the future to deal with them. Denis, in the past year to 18 months, people might have started to read a lot of news articles about these chemicals, which have been used in things like non-stick frying pans, food packaging, and firefighting foam for many years. But can you explain in very basic terms to anyone who might not be sure, what are PFAS?
Well, they're chemicals. There's over 14,000 of them, specific chemicals that have a carbon backbone and then fluorine atoms attached to that, and with various head groups or end members type thing. And they're pervasive in the environment. They really like to go to interfaces. So if they're like a soap, and that's why we use them in firefighting foams, is they would go to the interface between the oil, the fuel, and air, and then they would smother out the fire. They're quite efficient.
Andrew, it seems to me, doing my research, that these things are designed to resist pretty much everything. They resist heat, they resist grease, they resist...
That's amazing chemicals. So it's part of, looking at contamination in the environment, you're looking at the marvellous chemicals that we've used for decades, and then you go, oh, gee, I guess this one actually has problems because some of its features are also some of its bugs, if you like. So if you remember back to your high school chemistry and the periodic table of the elements, the element fluorine is in the top right-hand corner. It is the most electronegative element in existence. And because of that electronegativity, the bond that it forms with carbon is really strong, really tight, so much so that Unlike most organic contaminants, so far no one is aware of any microbes, bugs, that can gain energy from carving that bond. Most other contaminants, like your dry cleaning solvents or your petrols, other organic contaminants will break down eventually in the environment through a range of mechanisms, including biological and physical and others. But there's a group of PFAS chemicals, the terminal degradants, I guess is a good name for them, that tend to not break down any further.
They're kind of a bit too good at their job, I guess.
Yep, they're well engineered. Absolutely.
And these things were, I think, developed first in the 1930s, but kind of gained traction in the 1950s maybe. And am I right in saying, non-stick frying pans, firefighting foam, food packaging, what else have they been used for?
Well, we would have used it stain resistance in carpets, maybe fire resistance in some materials as well. We would have had it in, let's say, Patagonia used to use it all the time for weatherproofing their jackets, and they got out of that market maybe 10 years ago. And they're having difficulty getting the same efficiency of weatherproofing because they don't use PFAS anymore. So it would have been pervasive, maybe in our tents and ski wax.
Yeah, I heard that ski wax is a thing. It's quite an unusual one, I think, but I guess for the same reason that it gives you some good protection on your boards, I guess, and your skis.
Well, if you think of the properties of a Teflon fry pan or PTFE lubricant for a bicycle and the Gore-Tex jackets, the ski wax, the lubricant is very, very good. So yes, it's been banned in some ways, but you can still find it in your local ski shop at the slopes. And by the very fact that you must re-wax your skis on a regular basis, you can guess where the wax is ending up all over the mountains. But even just looking around this room, my coffee cup at the moment it's got a PFAS coating on it. Your takeaway lunch, the box of chips, would have had a PFAS waterproof coating. Some of those coatings on food packaging are up to 50 parts per million of PFAS, which when we're talking scale is quite a high concentration of PFAS in everyday items that people are using and are not necessarily aware of what they contain. So scale is really important when considering the PFAS guidelines and PFAS in the environment. Those of us who practice in the field talk about parts per million, parts per billion, parts per trillion. So 1 part per million is 1 milligram per kilogram. A part per trillion is 1 nanogram per kilogram, or 1 nanogram per litre if you're looking at water. The numbers that we're talking about are, some people like to use Olympic swimming pools. Well, that metaphor runs out with PFAS because it's Olympic swimming pools lined up between Melbourne and Sydney, and just put 1 drop in that, and that's 1 nanogram per litre. It's very, very, very small.
And I think you covered it a little bit before, Andrew, but in general, why are these things so hard to break down? I guess engineers and scientists have tried. Now they've identified this problem. It's just that the bond between those atoms is so strong. Is that right?
Yes. So to destroy PFAS rather than separating it from the environment, you need to get the temperature up quite high, maybe 1,000 degrees or so. But the US Department of Defense and Department of Energy and EPA have been funding marvellous research projects known as, I'll just use the acronyms, SERDP and ESTCP. They're quite long names, but if you look up SERDP and ESTCP, you'll find them online. They've funded some magnificent research into a variety of destruction methods that use ultrasonication. They use a reversal of the methods that we use to generate the PFAS, so electronic or electrical methods, and they've had some very good success, but it's difficult and
costly. So at scale, very costly. And that's the US government. The Australian government has also funded. I think Andrew was alluding to that as well. And I guess with regards to how hard they are to degrade, in a fire, if you're using a firefighting foam, you do not want it to degrade. So it's engineered such that it will not degrade under, let's say, normal fire conditions. So really, it's designed so that it does resist environmental degradation.
And this is why they've picked up this name Forever Chemicals, and also that they've been found kind of everywhere, really.
Yeah, that's right.
I've read stories that they're in 99% of the population. Is that correct, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew gives guest lectures in my class and he shows a nice graph, and it is decreasing with time, or certainly the ones that are regulated that we're paying attention to are decreasing with time as major international suppliers or manufacturers are phasing that product out.
Can I pick up on something? So the notion of forever chemical, it's kind of neat and sexy, but lead contamination has been around since the Romans. Lead is a forever chemical. It's elemental. You can destroy PFAS, but you can't destroy lead unless you put it into the heart of the sun. Mercury, arsenic, these are also forever chemicals that cause real harm to human health, where the effects are very well demonstrated. The dose-response relationship is very, very clear, and people around the world, often of lower socioeconomic groups, are being harmed and their children being poisoned from exposure to these elements.
Picking up on that, though, people are starting to read stories in the newspaper about the potential health problems of PFAS. I believe it's been designated as a carcinogen in at least America, if not by any kind of global body. Maybe you can correct me.
The World Health Organization has.
The World Health.
Yeah.
So globally it has. And I guess people are maybe starting to get scared. If they put those two things together, it's in 99% of people and it's also a carcinogen. They're kind of worried about health aspects. Do you think that's fair?
Well, bacon and alcohol are also carcinogens, and we don't really worry about them. So I think we need to have a measured response and obviously pay attention and reduce to the extent possible PFAS in our daily lives, for sure.
Contextualization is important. So what is different about PFAS? Let's compare it to, say, lead poisoning that the Romans had. It's not naturally occurring, right? So it was made in a factory. It has travelled a long, long way from where it was released in the environment. And the people who are exposed to it often have no control over that exposure. I choose to drink red wine, have a steak, eat bacon, and wear my Gore-Tex jacket when I hike. I choose that. I choose that exposure. But no one is choosing to be exposed to PFAS contamination, either directly through their drinking water or indirectly through living in the modern society that we are.
Do you accept that some people might be scared, though? Like when they read those stories, and there might be certain specific media publications that like to, get clicks and maybe scaremonger. And I'm thinking maybe also that smoking was once deemed to be going, it's safe, don't worry about it. Asbestos, the problems with asbestos were not necessarily known at the time and obviously grew over time. Do you think people might start thinking that that would be the case with PFAS?
Well, absolutely. And people are scared. I certainly know that. PFAS is regulated in Australia in drinking water at very, very low concentrations. And that's somewhat of a debate in the literature. Should it be that low? And people do wonder about that. It's regulated similarly to other jurisdictions, but there are other jurisdictions around the world that have a little bit lower of drinking water guidance. And very, very few people in Australia would consume water that's above those guidelines. So if one is to read in the media or get the impression that all of Sydney's water is contaminated, that would be false. In terms of what I know, that would be false, and that would be scaremongering. Certainly in the Blue Mountains, about 50,000 people would have been consuming, unfortunately for a reasonable amount of time, PFAS above U.S. drinking water guidelines and maybe the European Union as well, and the incoming Australian drinking water guidelines. So it gets tricky because the guidelines are always, well, not always, but they are becoming more and more stringent with time, certainly with PFAS.
And I believe the Australian regulations, I think you just alluded to it there, they've been under review kind of recently and they've announced that potentially they're going to lower the limits. Is that correct?
Well, it's out for consultation. So there was a consultation process last year. The National Health and Medical Research Council, the NHMRC, is responsible for determining drinking water guidelines in Australia. The consultant they engaged recommended no change to the drinking water guideline. And the members of the NHMRC elected to change the drinking water guideline against that advice, and they outlined the reasons for doing so in that document they published. As a practitioner, it introduces some complications. There's another government agency, Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, that is responsible for setting food exposure limits. In health guidelines and toxicology, there's a notion of a tolerable daily intake, a TDI. So in PFAS, for example, which is one of the many PFAS, PFAS is a family and PFAS is one chemical. For PFAS, under the FSAN, the Food Standards Guidance, they say you can have 20 nanograms per kilogram of body weight per day. And you multiply that through a 70 kilogram adult drinking 2 litres of water a day. You divide by 10 because you assume they only get 10% of their intake from drinking water and 90% from elsewhere. And you get the current drinking water guideline of 70 nanograms per litre. The proposed drinking water guideline is 4 nanograms per litre.
Which is a lot less.
It's 17.5 times lower, it's 15 to 20 times lower. And Food Standards has looked at their number and they're standing by it. So they're up at 70. NHMRC is thinking about 4. Now, the problem as a practitioner is that the guideline for how much you can have in your soil in your backyard growing vegetables depends on a tolerable daily intake. Do we take the FSANs or the NHMRC guideline? The amount of PFAS that you can have in your milk comes from FSANs, but the guideline for the recycled water at the farm or how much biosolids you can put on the farm as fertiliser, that may be driven by the NHMRC. And so we have a disconnect in our regulatory guidance.
And would you, as practitioners or experts, prefer those numbers to be the same? And do you think over a period of time, maybe with a bit more research into this and seeing the impacts, that those numbers would stabilise and become the same?
Well, they should be the same. Like the government of Australia should have one standard on terms of the amount that comes into your body per day. And then they say, let's say 10, 20% comes from drinking water. Well, then you can figure that out number. And then there's food. And there's the NEMP, that's for biosolids. That's another guidelines that come out. All these different guidelines, they all look at how much your body can uptake or how much, what's acceptable. So what you need to figure out first and foremost, what's an acceptable number, and then get down into how much will come into your food, how much will come into your water, how much is allowed in your soils or your biosolids, all of that. So we need one value.
So perhaps it might be useful to take a step back. So I think of PFAS as there being two, domains of practice for me as an environmental consultant. On the one hand, we have contaminated sites. We have a place where someone has released a very large amount of PFAS to the environment for whatever reason. Initially, this was firefighting. Department of Defence was very busy with this and still is very busy with this. All the firefighting departments. It's now progressing through to various industrial premises and so on and so forth. But it's a point source release of PFAS to the environment due to an activity that took place in the past. And the other frame of reference I have is incidental, the soup that we're living in, if you like. So that includes recycled water, drinking water, reuse of biosolids, which is a byproduct from sewage treatment. It includes compost. So my coffee cup, I put that into the compost stream because that's what it says on the sign. And then all those PFAS get released into the compost and then they come out in the vegetable garden and it grows up into the plants. So that's what I see as a background or an ambient exposure. The difficulty with the changing guidelines and with a bit of a disconnect with the guidelines is that it becomes difficult to tell the contaminated site from the ambient. Everything is above the guidelines.
Going back to what you said, Denis, before about first of all, they work out the tolerable level. How do they do that? And what do you think that tolerable level should be?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not a health professional. So there's different governments and health agencies around the world do it differently. And let's say some might use a rat, some might use a mouse, and they sort of look at the negative health outcomes associated with that, and then they would have some kind of scaling factors and bring it down to us. And it gets a bit complicated.
At the risk of offending toxicologists, and I don't want to offend toxicologists, but if I would explain it in very simple terms, researchers take a large amount of one chemical and feed it to a small animal for a short period of time and try to see what happens. And then from that, they extrapolate what a small concentration of lots of chemicals does to a human over a long period of time. It's difficult. It's really difficult. And because it's so difficult, there are uncertainty factors in the guidelines. So you poison the rat and you work out what it does to the rat and you come up with a number. And then that gives you a dose. then you divide it by 10 for this reason, you divide it by 10 for that reason, you divide it by 3 for that reason, and the tolerable daily intake is 300 times lower than what you derived in your experiment. And that's probably protective.
And that's one way. I think we've talked about this, Andrew, in the past. There's the island in the Pacific or in the Atlantic that has is very localized, and I think they eat a lot of fish. And they can associate, because it's an isolated case, and they know what they're consuming, and it's not just PFAS. There's other chemicals they're consuming. They're sort of trying to figure out the health outcomes associated with what's coming in, and then compare it to the general, the world population. But as Andrew's saying, it gets pretty tricky in try to distinguish. This is because of one chemical or 3 chemicals, as an example.
The causation versus correlation is diabolically hard. A group of epidemiologists from the Australian National University made a submission to the Federal Senate inquiry into PFAS last year. It's available online. They note in their submission that there's very clear anxiety and psychological concern in the communities that have been exposed to a lot of PFAS. And so in these communities living near very heavily contaminated sites where they've drunk polluted water, but they're unable to draw any other health effects. So there's a massive amount of, I think, legitimate concern from these communities. They are worried, they are stressed, and that is real. The health effects have a lot more uncertainty attached to them. The epidemiologists, they aren't sure.
Well, an example of that is these people, their houses are worth nothing, right? And that is a stress in itself. So then getting at if they've got a negative health outcome, which would be horrible, is it associated with just that stress, or drinking PFAS? That's really an example of the types of things that's unclear.
Everything's interwoven.
Yeah.
Looking forward, can you give me some examples of some technologies or new advances that are being made to detect PFAS, but also remove PFAS from the environment?
The detection of PFAS is one of the problems. Due to the nature of the compound, they are much easier to detect at extraordinarily low concentrations compared to other contaminants of concern.
Is that because they don't go away?
No, it's because they pop up on the machine very clearly. They are really easy to detect at crazy low concentrations, 10, 100,000 times lower than you can detect other contaminants.
So we don't have a problem with detecting them?
It is time consuming. I was just in the field in the Great Barrier Reef looking at contaminants, and it would take, to get one water sample, it might take 3 days of pretty hard work to get a batch of them through and tell you the concentration. So it is straightforward to do with some nice instruments.
Yeah, and it's commercially available. So you can go to a commercial lab and pay, $150 and get your result back in a week, or pay double that and get it back the next day.
So the bigger focus is on new technologies to degrade. Would that be correct?
Well, an instrument to detect PFAS might cost $500,000. So if we could do it easier, then certainly that people are actively looking at quantification at low concentrations as well, because it is a bit of an expensive exercise. Andrew's saying $100, $150 per sample, but if you go to a contaminated site, that you're doing hundreds of samples. That adds up pretty fast.
When I was doing some research for this episode and I was looking at potential new technologies that might be out there in terms of removing PFAS, I saw a few different bands of ideas. Better filtration was one, bioremediation, chemical destruction. Could you maybe talk about those potential improvements in technologies?
Sure. Well, filtration, an ion exchange resin or activated carbon would be traditional ways that you would remove PFAS. And in the Blue Mountains, they would be using something like that. And, we would in our lab actively looking at ion exchange, looking at a resin that you can engineer to remove certain types of PFAS and really optimize it is really the name of the game. Because a problem, not necessarily in Australia yet, but certainly internationally, is the shorter chain PFAS are hard to remove and hard to remove using activated carbon. So they're looking at what other technologies, how can we maybe optimize it such that we can remove them well and remove all PFAS.
It's pretty common for a treatment train to be designed. So it's very easy to remove PFAS from clean water. It's quite hard to remove it from dirty water. First, you need to make the water clean. So it depends whether you're treating surface water or groundwater or landfill leachate, you need to first remove pretty much nearly everything else except for salt, and then you can remove the PFAS as well. So activated carbon ion exchange, reverse osmosis, it works, but ion exchange is better. A neat technology is foam fractionation. So if you blow bubbles through the water, the PFAS will stick to the edge of the bubbles. They like interfaces, as Denis said. They love the air-water interface. So you blow bubbles through the water and it makes a foam. The PFAS is in the foam. You separate that out and the water comes out clean. It's a really cool technology and it works better if the water is dirty.
And then once you do with that, what do you do?
It's at high concentration and you need to do something with it. But you're not treating a large volume, you're treating a relatively small volume.
Because it hasn't gone away. You've just concentrated.
It's a separation process.
That's right.
And if you would take your activated carbon to the landfill, there's not much else to do with it. In the US, they recycle or regenerate their activated carbon and put it back into the community. Ion exchange resin, there's single-use resin and there's regenerable resin where you use methanol to take out the PFAS and then you can reuse the resin. Foam fractionation, you get a hyper-concentrated foamate, which you can then entrain on a activated carbon or resin if you want, or just take the liquid and incinerate it. There are some cement kilns that are licensed to take concentrated PFAS, like your firefighting foams. In Melbourne, there are some waste facilities that are licensed to incinerate PFAS in soils.
I guess with all of these things, there's a cost involved, time, money. Is there a point at which you say it's not worthwhile to carry on? Going back to those tolerable levels, I guess, as well, that you can't get rid of this completely?
Well, there's not just the human health effects, there's the ecological effects as well. And the current ecological guideline number for PFAS is 20 times lower than the new proposed drinking water guideline. It's 0.2 nanograms per litre. And that's pretty much the detection limit of most commercial labs. So if you are going to do a treatment process, you need to work out what are your measures of success and how clean does it really need to be. If it's a separation process, then you need to work out what is the economical way to destroy the PFAS that you pull out. In some cases, it's taken to landfill, but in some cases, it's incinerated.
Something to bear in mind is the carbon footprint associated with all these treatment technologies. And we talked a little bit about soil earlier. And the problem is that soil, it could be just a little bit over at a lot of places. And then the question is, what do we do with that soil? You can't move your soil from here to there. Are we going to incinerate all these soils? We're going to wash them? How are we going to do it? So we have to come up with some kind of pragmatic, risk-based approach and understand there's going to be ambient levels and find out what's an acceptable level. Because we don't want to have climate change because we're removing PFAS. That's not the outcome that we want.
Might be a tricky question, but where do you see this issue in 30 years' time? Do you think somehow it will be solved, or do you think this will still be an ongoing conversation/debate?
Well, it's a great question. And let's say 5 years ago, people thought it would go away. And it's only become more stringent, heightened awareness associated with it. So the crystal ball, we're probably not great at it. And really what we need is some health advice.
I think in 30 years' time, it'll be passé. We'll have other issues, I'm sure. I've been working in this field now for nearly 30 years, and we keep talking about doing ourselves out of a job. And we say, the great, big, dirty, nasty contaminated sites, yep, they're cleaned up, but we keep finding new and interesting things. And currently PFAS is new and interesting. It's interesting from the perspective of scientifically and chemically, the stuff it's just a bit weird. It's a bit different, and it is legitimately very interesting. We keep getting surprised when we look into it more and more, and we keep learning. But I would advocate that in 30 years' time, the health guidelines should be resolved. We should have a fairly solid understanding about what is safe and what is not. And we may be living in a world where everyone is always exposed to levels of PFAS above the safe limit. That is a possibility. And we'll just have to live in that world because we don't have another world. Or it may be that the limits go up and attention is focused on cleaning specific problems, banning specific chemicals, changing specific behaviours, and then everything else is okay.
Another thing about looking to the future, I guess, is these chemicals were introduced in the 1930s, increased in the 1950s. As we said before, they were very good at what they did. I guess we need to find a replacement for them. People still need to fight fires. Non-stick pans are still quite useful. How easy is it going to be to have those items with something new?
Well, we need to go and look at where PFAS is used and then find alternates for that or make it unavailable with notice. And the Australian government is limiting the amount of PFAS, of some regulated PFAS that come into the country that goes into effect in a couple of months. So effectively, the industry will have to come up with something else and we'll have to use something else for those few. But as that expands, the European Union wants to ban all with some conditions. So when those things happen, people will be looking at a different type of chemical.
So there's, I think, some challenges ahead. The fact is that PFAS chemicals are just really, really good at what they were designed to do. And so replacement chemicals aren't always as good, and replacement approaches aren't always as good. I think a great exception, though, is my fry pan. I use a cast iron fry pan at home, and I would commend that to everyone. The Teflon fry pan's been in the bin for a long time. But, when it comes to firefighting foams, the fluorine-free foams, they work. Possibly you have to use them in a different way because they're possibly sometimes not quite as good as the fluorinated foams. As Patagonia is finding, it's hard to make your jacket as waterproof as when you use Gore-Tex. Scotchgard was a great waterproof treatment for carpets and soft upholsteries. It was full of PFAS. So now we have some more stains on our carpet. Your takeaway food may get through the container faster. Or maybe we should just do away with disposable food containers. Just bring a ceramic. I'll bring a keep cup to the cafe usually. So it's not just changing chemicals, it's also changing behaviours and changing expectations.
I don't know if this is playing devil's advocate, but if you start designing new chemicals, is there a potential that in 20 or 30 years there'll be a new podcast saying, what about all those new chemicals that are causing problems?
Oh, there's always perverse outcomes. So some people were scared off drinking tap water in Sydney as a result of the Blue Mountains issue, and that's just outrageous because the Sydney tap water is amongst the cleanest in the world. It's really, really good. Some people may be turning to bottled water, which introduces risk of microplastics. Now, microplastics, that's another podcast. Nanoplastics, but it's a question mark now, whether it's a concern. So we do have a body burden of PFAS. We also have a body burden of plastic, in our brain and other parts of our body where you'd think they shouldn't be. What are they doing? No one knows. So any change in behaviour brings risk of perverse outcomes.
And the new chemicals as well, I guess. You're not going to know until a period of time moving forward. When you
do design or maybe seek approval for them, you do sort of know the structure and you can kind of come up with some thoughts around that, certainly. But you wouldn't know, and maybe they wouldn't do 100% due diligence, in advance.
But do you think the regulation environment is better now in terms of those things people would be looking forward and saying, yeah, that's great. Are they going to degrade? Are they going to cause a problem down the track, which maybe they weren't thinking of in the 1930s and 1950s?
There'd be a bit more awareness, but I doubt that there's as much awareness as we might want, certainly.
I think we'll keep getting it wrong, to be honest. So, those firefighting foams that have caused a lot of the problems, the manufacturer advised the people they sold it to that it was biodegradable. And technically, that, good old firefighting foam from the 1970s was biodegradable because by the definition, 80% of it broke down within a certain number of days. It's just the 20% that was the problem and still is the problem. So, the chemicals industry is very clever, highly motivated, much better resourced than government. Government bans one chemical. The chemical sector, they can swap out a fluorine for a chlorine or a bromine or something else and they have a different chemical. And then the government can take 10 or 20 years to catch up. So, yes, some PFAS have been banned in Australia as of 1st of July, but most of those were already voluntarily withdrawn from use 25 years ago. And you can see that in the blood testing of the Australian population. So PFAS in particular, the blood concentration has plummeted once 3M voluntarily removed it from a range of chemicals in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Do you have some sympathy, though, especially in terms of firefighting foam, that's been designed for a very good purpose and is very beneficial, and the people using it are, trying to do good things, and unfortunately it's now being, I don't know whether demonized is the right word, but it's obviously a major factor to these PFAS. So there's kind of a moral question.
Oh, there's a massive moral question. So it's outrageous, really. So these are the good guys. So Department of Defence, the fire brigades, these are organisations that put their lives on the line to save others. They are putting everything on the line for public service. They were following the manufacturer's instructions. They were training in accordance with the procedures. Everything was agreed. And it's horrendous that now, looking back, they are being painted as the bad guys because they thought they were doing the right thing at the time. So I do think that there's some culpability there in some of the manufacturers of these products for a lack of transparency and lack of communication. And what I would advocate for, 30 years into the future, is that we do need better information, better transparency. And if the manufacturer finds out that what they're selling has a potential risk associated with it, don't let it come out in court cases 30, 40 years down the track. Just reveal it and address it and move on.
I'm going to say two things to that is the firefighters, they used it. So they have the highest blood levels. So really what they need is support because they were, as Andrew says, doing the right thing and really protecting the general public. I would also say that the government needs to step up when they have information that could be of concern and will be of concern to them in the future. They need to let the public know. They need to message it right. But just because PFAS, let's say, if it wasn't regulated in Australia, but it was regulated in many jurisdictions historically around the world, they may not have let the public know that it was or could be a concern. It would be a concern in the US or in Europe, but not necessarily in Australia, because it really confuses the public, and they were really, really angry, and rightly so, I would suggest.
And just kind of, I think you did mention it in passing maybe, that there are some new technologies for these firefighting foams in the future that don't rely as heavily or at all on PFAS?
That's right, yes. Fluorine-free firefighting foam, yes. And it does exist. It's existed for a while in Australia. So that it is used. That's the standard now, not PFAS-laden foam.
So nearly everyone has now changed out. So after the issues with PFOS became apparent, so the O in PFOS stands for octane. It's got 8 carbons. Newer C6 foams were developed with 6 carbons. And they were used a lot from the early 2000s through to maybe 10 years ago. Now these are also being phased out in favour of fluorine-free foams. So I don't have special knowledge, but I'm quite sure that Department of Defence, all the airports, all the fire brigades, and the majority of the bulk petroleum terminals have all changed out and are using fluorine-free foams now.
Major organizations wouldn't want a legacy. So if they can and can safely put out a fire, they will look for an alternative. I think there were some issues, let's say with a submarine, or there were certain very, very boutique needs that it took a little bit longer, but I think also they found solutions as well.
I might move on to a final question. If you could give one piece of advice about PFAS that anyone, whether that be individuals, businesses or governments, should follow for the next few years, let's say, what would your one piece of advice be?
Don't sweat the small stuff. I need to contextualise that. We are all exposed to PFAS everywhere all the time. We all have a body burden. You say 99, I say 100% of people around the world have PFAS. It just depends on whether you can detect it. It has been detected in rain. So it's everywhere. We need to find the big problems, fix the big problems, and don't sweat the small stuff.
And how would you define the big problem? What are your one or two big problems?
I would define it in 2 dimensions. I would define it as a contaminated land problem. There are some, let's call them contaminated sites, that need to be addressed. And the second dimension is in chemical use. We are using PFAS in our day-to-day lives without being aware of it, and it's a little bit crazy and needs to stop. PFAS is commonly found in all sorts of things in the environment. It's even found in many different forms of makeup and even eye drops. There's an eye drop called Maibo, which is 100% perfluorohexyl octane. When that is put into your system, the octane will drop off the perfluorohexyl and you'll get a PFAS in your eye, in your bloodstream, and then ultimately in the sewage treatment plant. That needs labelling. It needs regulation. That's just one example. I mentioned the food packaging earlier. It needs to come out of food packaging so that we can safely compost it. So if you, on the one hand, address the contaminated sites and the other hand, address the huge fluxes or mass movements of PFAS into our ambient environment, then everything else will be under control.
Denis, how easy will it be for you to give one piece of advice?
Well, I'll try to be shorter, but Andrew had some great thoughts. So I think that the public needs to know that medical advice suggests that PFAS, maybe only 20% comes from drinking water. So if you're concerned about PFAS in your day-to-day lives, you need to look at all sources of use. And I would say, by and large, Australian drinking water, tap water, is great. I think that Andrew said contaminated sites and sort of alluded to it in our day-to-day lives. Well, at wastewater treatment plants, utilities, when we flush a toilet, we're putting PFAS down the drain that's going to a wastewater treatment plant. And like the firefighters, we don't want to brand the utilities as bad either. It's us. So we need to have some consideration about the chemicals that we use, the PFAS and other chemicals that we're flushing down the toilet, because it goes out in the water, treated water, because it's not treated in the wastewater treatment plant. It doesn't degrade. Or it goes into the biosolids. So it's just staying there and we're putting it back into the environment. So we need to stop using it so that it doesn't get into the environment.
That's great pieces of advice from both of you. And it's been really interesting to speak with you both about this really important topic. Professor Denis O'Carroll, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And also to Andrew Mitchell, it's been a pleasure to chat.
Likewise.
Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. Thank you for listening. I've been Neil Martin, and I hope you'll join me again soon for the next episode in our Engineering the Future series. You've been listening to UNSW's Engineering the Future podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our series to stay updated on upcoming episodes. Check out our show notes for details on in-person events, panel discussions, and more fascinating insights into the future of engineering.